You guys have really outdone yourselves this time. You sent us a ton of stuff on this Harris-Trump debate, transcripts, articles, you name it. We're talking domestic policy, foreign policy, and of course we've got to look at the potential fallout. Globally, I mean. Places like Africa and Asia are definitely going to feel the impact of this election. And what about Russia? China? What can they expect?
Yeah, it's definitely a big one, especially with Biden out of the picture and those polls so close. This debate was a total nail-biter. You can really feel the tension, even just reading the transcripts.
And don't forget, we've got Perplexity AI and Google's Notebook LM on our side for this deep dive. They're helping us sort through this mountain of information so we can break it all down for you.
They've been a lifesaver, that's for sure.
Okay, so ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's start with the basics, like the whole no audience thing. That was pretty unique, right? Just the candidates and the moderators, no cheering crowds or anything.
Yeah, that must have been intense, like a political pressure cooker.
No kidding. No room for error with those polls so close. Every word, every gesture, it all gets magnified.
So let's talk about the economy. Trump really went after inflation, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He was calling it a country buster, saying it was the worst in U.S. history. It's classic Trump, really, appealing to people's anxieties about their finances.
And then he slammed Harris's economic plan, claiming it's basically a top sales tax that would cost families an extra $4,000 a year. 20% more on everyday stuff that's a big deal.
That was his claim, yes. But Harris countered by bringing in the big guns, Goldman Sachs, a whole bunch of Nobel laureates. They're all predicting that it's actually Trump's plan that would wreck the economy and explode the deficit.
Dueling economists. So how's the average voter supposed to make sense of all that? It's got to be tough sifting through all those numbers and predictions.
You're telling me voters are bombarded with information from every direction? It's hard to know what to trust.
All right, let's move on to immigration. This one got pretty heated, right?
You could say that. Trump called the current immigration policy insane and blamed it for rising crime rates. He talked about millions of people pouring in from prisons and mental institutions, taking jobs, committing crimes, even taking over whole towns.
Wow. He's really painting a bleak picture there. Appealing to some deep-seated fears, for sure.
Absolutely. But Harris hit back, drawing on her experience prosecuting criminal organizations involved in human trafficking. She pointed to a bipartisan border security bill she supported.
Okay, so trying to offer a concrete solution instead of just fear-mongering.
Exactly. She said the bill would increase border agents, address the fentanyl crisis, but she claimed Trump killed it because he'd rather campaign on problems than actually solve them. She even challenged viewers to go to a Trump rally and see how much time he actually spends talking about people's actual needs.
Ooh, that's a bold move. Turning the tables on him.
It was. We'll have to see if it resonated with voters.
Okay, so another hot-button issue, abortion. Things got pretty personal here.
Yeah, Trump claimed victory after overturning Roe v. Wade. As said, the issue belongs to the states now. He insisted he's not for a national abortion ban, but wouldn't say if he'd veto one.
So dodging the question a bit, trying to play both sides.
Maybe. But Harris called him out on that, pointed to the real-world consequences of abortion bans. Women denied care after miscarriages, young survivors of incest forced to carry pregnancies. She really hit hard on the emotional impact.
Definitely drawing a sharp contrast there. Champion of women's rights versus not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she pledged to sign a bill reinstating Roe v. Wade protections if she's elected, while warning that Trump would sign a national ban.
Okay, so let's talk January 6th. That's a topic that's not going away anytime soon.
It really isn't. And it led to a very tense moment in the debate. Harris, who was at the Capitol that day, directly accused Trump of inciting the mob and attacking democracy.
She was there, so it's a lot more personal for her, isn't it?
Absolutely. And she connected it to a larger pattern of behavior. Charlottesville, the fine people on both sides comment, the stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys.
Painting a pretty damning picture there.
She was. Trump, on the other hand, deflected blame. Claimed he offered 10,000 National Guard troops, but was rejected by Nancy Pelosi.
So passing the buck, essentially.
You could see it that way, but of course there's been plenty of evidence debunking those claims about the troops.
Right, right. The whole thing really highlights how divided the country still is on this issue. And it raises some pretty big questions about the future of democracy in America.
No doubt about it. It's a reminder of how fragile those democratic institutions really are.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk foreign policy. Things got especially interesting when they started discussing Ukraine.
For sure. The war in Ukraine is a global flashpoint, and it was really fascinating to see how each candidate approached it. Trump, as always, went for the bold statement. He said he could end the war in 24 hours.
Typical Trump. Big promise, not a lot of detail.
Exactly. And he actually dodged the question about whether he even wants Ukraine to win.
Which is kind of a big deal, considering how much is at stake for global security.
It is. Harris jumped on that ambiguity, arguing that Trump would just give it up to Putin. She highlighted all the aid the U.S. has given Ukraine, helping them stay free and independent.
So she's framing herself as the strong leader standing up to Putin.
Exactly. She even challenged Trump directly, asking him to tell Polish Americans how quickly he'd abandon them if Putin asked.
Wow, putting him on the spot there.
She was. And bringing NATO into the equation, that's a smart move.
So how did Trump respond to that?
Oh, he went on the attack, called Harris a horrible negotiator, and even claims she hates Israel. He said Israel won't exist in 2 years if she's elected.
Those are some serious accusations. Did he offer any evidence to back them up?
Not really.
Oh.
He made some vague reference to Harris's diplomatic trip to Ukraine before the war, implying she somehow caused it.
So, blaming her for the war.
Basically, it's a huge oversimplification, obviously.
Seems like he's trying to deflect from his own stance on Ukraine, which has always been a bit murky.
It's a classic Trump tactic.
Yeah.
We'll have to see if it works.
Okay, so we've talked about the economy, immigration, abortion, January 6th, and now Ukraine. This election isn't just about American politics. It's about America's role in the world.
Absolutely. And the decisions made in this election are going to have huge consequences, not just for Americans, but for people all over the planet.
And that brings us to the global economic impact. This is where things get really interesting.
It does. How would a Harris presidency affect the global economy compared to a Trump presidency? That's the question we need to answer.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be taking a closer look at how this election could shake things up economically, especially for places like Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Russia, and China.
We'll be examining the potential fallout, analyzing the impact on trade, investment, development aid. It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're picking up where we left off exploring the potential global economic impact of the U.S. election. We've unpacked that explosive debate, dissected the candidates' stances on domestic and foreign policy, and now it's time for the big picture. How could this election reshape the world economy?
Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, first stop Africa. A continent with tons of economic potential, but also facing huge challenges like poverty, inequality, and climate change.
And its relationship with the U.S., let's just say it's been complicated.
Trump's America First agenda often meant aid cuts and a focus on what U.S. businesses could get out of the deal.
Oh, and those tariffs definitely had an impact on African exports. Now, Harris has talked about a different approach, promoting economic opportunity, strengthening partnerships, tackling shared challenges together.
So more of a collaborative vibe, aiming for long-term development that benefits everyone.
That seems to be the idea. Trade is one area to watch closely, specifically the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGA. This agreement gives many African countries preferential access to U.S. markets.
Right, AGOA. It's been a huge boost for some African economies, helping them grow their exports and create jobs.
But Trump wasn't a fan, called it a bad deal for America. Who knows what would have happened if he'd won? Would he have renewed it, renegotiated it to favor the U.S.?
Yeah, that could have been devastating for some African economies that rely heavily on AGOA.
No doubt. Harris, though, has expressed support for AGOA. She's talked about how important trade is for driving economic growth in Africa. She's also mentioned increasing investment in things like infrastructure, energy, and technology, which could create new opportunities for both U.S. and African businesses.
So, under Harris, we might see a shift away from traditional aid and more towards trade and investment.
It's a possibility, but whoever's in the Oval Office, they're going to face pressure to put American jobs and economic interests first.
Always a balancing act, right? Okay, let's move on to Asia, another region with sky-high economic stakes. We can't ignore the whole U.S.-China rivalry either.
It's a major factor. Asia has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's a massive market for U.S. goods and services.
And Trump definitely shook things up there with his tariffs-first approach. Those trade wars disrupted supply chains and drove up costs for everyone.
Yeah, and then there was his decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. A huge trade deal meant to counter China's growing influence in the region.
Many analysts saw that as a mistake, ceding ground to China, weakening U.S. alliances.
Some would say so. Now, Harris has said she'd consider rejoining the TPP, but whether she could actually do it is another story. She's also talked about strengthening those ties with key allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and promoting a global system that benefits everyone, not just China.
So more of a team effort to counter China.
Exactly. But how effective can that be, really, especially with China's economic power and its increasingly assertive military presence?
It's a high-stakes game for
Yep.
sure. Okay, let's talk about the Middle East, a region that's been deeply impacted by U.S. foreign policy, both good and bad.
The economic fallout has been immense. Think about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trillions of dollars spent, the whole region destabilized, extremism and terrorism on the rise.
Trump took a different approach, right?
Yeah.
Withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, strengthening those ties with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And then there were the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations between Israel and some Arab states.
A diplomatic win for some, but others criticized it for sidelining the Palestinians and empowering authoritarian regimes.
It's complex. No easy answers there. Now, Harris has talked about a more constructive role for the U.S. in the Middle East, prioritizing diplomacy and human rights.
She's also talked about addressing the root causes of conflict, like poverty and inequality, and increasing investment in economic development and humanitarian assistance. But, let's be realistic, the Middle East is a tough nut to crack. Even the best intentions can go wrong.
Yeah, any U.S. president faces an uphill battle there. Okay, let's shift focus to Russia. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia has become increasingly adversarial in recent years.
And the economic consequences have been substantial, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the wave of sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies.
Those sanctions have hit the Russian economy hard, but they've also had a ripple effect globally, driving up energy prices and disrupting those delicate supply chains.
You can't forget about Trump's relationship with Russia either. It was unusual, to say the least.
That's one way to put it. He praised Putin, downplayed Russian interference in U.S. elections, even suggested that Crimea rightfully belonged to Russia.
It often seemed like he was undermining efforts to contain Russia and support democracies in Eastern Europe.
It was definitely confusing. Now, Harris has taken a much tougher stance on Russia, condemning the invasion of Ukraine, supporting those strong sanctions.
She's also emphasized the importance of NATO and transatlantic unity as a way to deter further Russian aggression.
So the big question is, how would she handle the war in Ukraine? Would she try to negotiate with Putin? What's her strategy for dealing with this volatile relationship?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and the answers will have huge implications for European security and the global balance of power.
Okay, we've looked at the potential economic impact of this election on Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Russia.
But there's one more region we need to discuss, and it's arguably the most important in the long run: Latin America.
You're right. Latin America often gets overlooked in foreign policy discussions, but it has deep ties to the U.S. and significant economic and geopolitical clout.
And let's be honest, it's often borne the brunt of U.S. policies, from trade deals to military interventions to those never-ending drug wars.
Trump's approach to Latin America wasn't exactly friendly.
Remember his comments about Mexican immigrants, and then there was the threat of a border wall, the tariffs on Mexican goods, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which included several Latin American countries.
His policies often felt more like punishment than partnership.
Now, Harris, as the first female vice president with Latin American roots, has taken a different approach. She's emphasizing partnership, diplomacy, understanding.
She's talked about addressing the root causes of migration, promoting economic development, strengthening democratic institutions in the region.
But talk is cheap. Latin America is facing a ton of complex challenges: poverty, inequality, climate change, corruption, you name it.
And the U.S. has a long history of meddling in the region's affairs.
Exactly. So the question is, could a Harris administration break from the past and build a new era of cooperation and mutual respect?
That's the challenge and the opportunity for whoever wins this election. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground. We've analyzed that heated debate, dug into those clashing policies, domestic and foreign, even taken a look at the potential global economic fallout from Africa to Asia to, well, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back. What are the big takeaways? What should our listeners be thinking about as this election heats up?
You know, what really struck me wasn't just the policy differences. It was how clearly this debate showed just how divided America is right now.
It wasn't just disagreement, right? It felt like two completely different visions of what America should be, what its role in the world should be.
Exactly. Two competing narratives on the economy, on social issues, on America's place on the global stage, everything.
On the one hand, you've got Trump's America First approach, that strong nationalism, the focus on protecting American jobs and businesses. a more transactional way of dealing with other countries.
And then you have Harris, emphasizing global engagement, working with allies, a foreign policy that's driven more by values and ideals.
And of course, we can't forget those sharp divisions on issues like immigration, abortion, even the legitimacy of the 2020 election. The tension was palpable.
This election isn't just about choosing a president, it's about choosing a direction for the entire country, a path forward in a world that's only getting more complex and interconnected.
And as we've seen, those choices have consequences that reach far beyond the U.S. The economic impact alone could reshape global trade, investment, and development on a massive scale.
A win for Harris could mean a return to a more predictable, more cooperative U.S. on the world stage.
But a Trump victory, well, that could lead to more volatility, more uncertainty, maybe even a greater risk of conflict.
It's a lot to take in. I mean, we've covered a ton of information in this deep dive.
It is a lot. But that's exactly why it's so important to stay informed, to have those tough conversations, and most importantly, to vote.
Don't just absorb information. Analyze it. Think critically. Really consider the potential consequences of each candidate's policies, both at home and abroad.
Because ultimately, it's up to you, the voters. You hold the power to shape the future, not just for America, but for the kind of world we all want to live in.
And hey, if you want to keep exploring these complex issues, make sure to subscribe to Echo Explorers.
We'll be here breaking it all down, helping you navigate this ever-changing world. Until next time, keep diving.